The statue of Our Lady didn't just fall, she leaped. It sounds absurd. I know. Coming from a man of God, a priest who has dedicated his life to explaining the inexplicable, to finding the divine in the everyday, that word feels sacrilegious, blasphemous even to speak of the Blessed Mother, even her graven image, with such an active, almost violent verb. But there is no other word. She leaped. One moment she was tipping, precariously. An accident. A clumsy, heartbreaking accident unfolding in agonizing slow motion. The ceremonial platform, already wobbly, had given way. The wood groaned, splitting under the ancient weight. I saw it. We all saw it. The entire parish, gathered on the cold stone steps of St. Jude's, watched her go. Watched our hope, our last, precious link to generations of faith, about to shatter into 1,000 pieces on the unforgiving pavement. My heart seized. A gasp, a collective moan tore through the crowd. I heard Mr. Rossi cry out. Young Elena, usually so cynical, had her hands clapped over her mouth, her eyes wide with a terror I had never seen there before. It was a tragedy of splintering wood and splintering faith, moments from its inevitable, crushing conclusion. Then it stopped. No, not stopped. It held. She was suspended in the air, a foot from the ground, barely an arm's length from the jagged edge of the steps that would have annihilated her. She hung there, perfectly still, unmoving, caught. But by what? By whom? There was nothing. Nothing but the encroaching evening gloom, the last vestiges of a dying sunset, and a sudden, inexplicable scent. Roses. It wasn't a whisper. It was a deluge. A physical force of fragrance, not the gentle, sweet aroma of a single bloom from the altar. No. This was the crushing, overwhelming perfume of 1,000 rose gardens bursting into simultaneous bloom around us. It invaded every pore, filled every lung, burned in the back of our throats. It was too much, impossibly potent. It choked the breath in my chest, yet I felt an exhilarating terror, a sickening wonder. It was everywhere, drowning out the city's distant hum, the frantic beating of my own heart, the sudden, stunned silence that had fallen over my entire parish. The chaos of a clumsy accident evaporated. It didn't just vanish, it was erased, replaced by the deafening silence of an undeniable, utterly impossible divine act. My mind reeled. What did I just see? What was I seeing? My priestly training, decades of theological study, years spent comforting the bereaved, guiding the lost, explaining the tenets of faith. It all crumbled. My reason, my very grip on the observable world, dissolved like sugar in hot tea. The laws of man, the immutable laws of nature, gravity, inertia, cause and effect, they were all broken, shattered. Before the eyes of my entire flock, before my own eyes, I stared. We all stared, mouths agape. Some fell to their knees, not in prayer, not yet, in shock, in a surrender to the impossible. I saw tears streaming down faces, not of sorrow, but of sheer uncomprehending awe. Old Mr. Rossi, who had been straining under the statue's weight moments before, was now on his knees, his face turned towards the floating Virgin, his trembling hands pressed together. Elena, who had scorned every word of our novena, whose eyes were always clouded with a grief that festered into cynicism, she too was on the ground, not kneeling gracefully but collapsed, a heap of disbelief and dawning wonder, her gaze fixed, unblinking. The statue remained, serene, unperturbed. Her painted face, usually so placid, now seemed to hold a secret, an ancient knowledge. Her wooden robes, which should have been scratched and splintered, were whole, untouched. Golden light, soft and otherworldly, pulsed from within the very wood itself, pushing back the encroaching twilight, illuminating her. This was no trick of light, no mass hallucination. It was real, tangibly, terrifyingly real. My fingers instinctively sought the crucifix at my throat, but my hand trembled so violently I could barely hold it. How could this be? My mind screamed, even as my heart recognized a truth beyond words. I searched for a seam, a wire, some hidden mechanism. There was nothing. The air beneath her was empty. The platform she had fallen from was now a gaping space above her. She simply was there, in the space where she should not be. Suspended. My breath hitched. I wanted to speak, to offer some explanation, some comforting word. I was their shepherd. It was my duty. But my throat was dry, my tongue thick and useless. What words could encompass this? What theology could explain an object defying gravity, imbued with the impossible scent of roses, glowing with an inner light, all in the wake of an apparent accident? My mind grappled with the implications. Miracles. I had always believed in them, intellectually, spiritually, but always as stories from scripture, distant accounts, or quiet, personal moments of grace. Never like this. Never so overt, so brazenly defiant of the natural order. Never so public. The air thrummed with the inexplicable. The silence from the crowd was profound, broken only by the shuddering gasps of those struggling to comprehend what their own eyes were showing them. The scent of roses was now a physical presence, a palpable fog that pressed in on us, demanding our attention, demanding our belief. It was too intense, too perfect, too supernatural. This wasn't just a statue slipping from a platform. This was an intervention, a dramatic, undeniable punctuation mark in the very fabric of our reality. The question, the only question that truly mattered in that moment, wasn't how she had slipped. We knew how accidents happened. We understood entropy, decay, and human fallibility. No. The question that burned itself into my soul, into the very core of my priestly being, the question that would haunt every waking moment from that day forward, was why? Why heaven had refused to let her land. Why, at the very moment of our parish's demise, the Blessed Mother herself had chosen to make such an utterly impossible, undeniably miraculous statement. And that, my dear reader, is where our story truly begins. With a broken law of physics, a scent of roses, and a question that only heaven itself could answer. It hung there, that question, just like Our Lady, suspended in the darkening evening, promising a revelation that would alter not just St. Jude's, but everything I thought I knew about faith, about miracles, and about the sometimes startling ways God chooses to speak to us. This was not the end of our small parish's story. It was a beginning I could never have imagined. And I, Father Thomas, struggling still to reconcile what I saw with what I know, am here to tell you every unsettling, astonishing detail. The question hung there, just like Our Lady, suspended in the darkening evening, promising a revelation that would alter not just St. Jude's, but everything I thought I knew about faith, about miracles, and about the sometimes startling ways God chooses to speak to us. This was not the end of our small parish's story. It was a beginning I could never have imagined. And I, Father Thomas, struggling still to reconcile what I saw with what I know, am here to tell you every unsettling, astonishing detail. But before we speak of the impossible, we must speak of the ordinary, of the years that preceded that night, years steeped in a quiet, creeping despair that seemed to thicken the very air we breathed at St. Jude's. For a miracle to be truly understood, must be viewed against the backdrop of the bleakness it shatters. And my parish, dear friends, was a place where bleakness had settled deep into the marrow of its very stones. St. Jude's, named ironically for the patron of lost causes, was dying. It's a harsh truth to speak aloud, especially for a priest whose life's work is woven into the fabric of a particular community. But it was undeniable. Our church, a proud, if somewhat stoic edifice of gray stone and weathered wood, was tucked away in a forgotten corner of the city. Once its spire had been a beacon, visible from many neighborhoods, a testament to a thriving immigrant community's faith and aspirations. Now, newer, shinier buildings overshadowed us, and the once vibrant streets around us hummed with a different, indifferent rhythm. The scent of sanctity that I believed should permeate every Catholic church felt, in our fading corridors, increasingly thin, almost nostalgic, like the scent of old potpourri in an abandoned house. Our congregation, once a bustling tapestry of families filling every pew, had dwindled to a handful of the elderly and the deeply devoted. On any given Sunday, the cavernous nave, designed to hold hundreds, echoed with the scattered coughs of a few dozen souls. Their faces, etched with the wisdom of years and the weight of their own quiet struggles, were dear to me, each one a precious jewel in a setting that was slowly crumbling. But their numbers were few, their energy often frail, and their children and grandchildren, drawn by the siren calls of modern life, or simply by churches closer to their new homes, rarely returned. Our finances, once robust enough to support vibrant outreach programs and maintain our historic structure, were now a whisper of what they once were. The collection plates, passed with a solemn dignity that belied their meager contents, were a constant source of quiet heartbreak. The diocesan letters, once warm and encouraging, grew colder, more pointed, with each passing month. They spoke of resource allocation and consolidation, administrative euphemisms that chilled my heart, for I knew they meant the end of St. Jude's. I watched my flock grapple with this slow decay, this gradual erosion of their spiritual home, and felt the weight of it press down on my own shoulders, a burden I carried in every prayer, every sermon, every quiet moment of reflection. Among this dwindling flock, two souls in particular embodied our struggle, each in their own profound way. There was Mr. Rossi, our ancient sacristan, a man whose name was as synonymous with St. Jude's as the very altar itself. He was well into his 80s, his frame stooped like a question mark, his hands gnarled by a lifetime of honest labor and countless rosaries. His hair, what little remained, was a wispy halo of white, and his eyes, though often clouded with the fatigue of age, still held a piercing intensity when he spoke of the Mass or the Blessed Sacrament. He had served St. Jude's since his own youth, a living repository of its history, its joys, and now, its sorrows. His faith was as solid as the church's crumbling foundation, a granite pillar against the tide of doubt and decline. I remember one Tuesday morning after the meager daily mass, I found him polishing the brass candlesticks with a devotion that bordered on reverence, his breath misting on the tarnished metal. "Father," he'd said without looking up, his voice raspy with age but firm in conviction, "they can talk all they want about numbers and budgets, but this church is more than bricks and mortar, eh? It's where my wife, God rest her soul, said, 'I do.' It's where my son was baptized. It's where I learned to speak to God. You can't put a price on that. You can't close a heart." He paused, wiping a fleck of dust from a statue of St. Anthony, his gaze lingering on its serene face. "Heaven hears. Even when the noise of the world is too loud, heaven hears the silence of a faithful heart." His words were a balm to my own wavering spirit, yet they also highlighted the immense, almost insurmountable challenge we faced. Mr. Rossi was a rock, but even rocks erode over centuries. He embodied the faithful persistence that made our church special, but also the vulnerability of a generation that was slowly fading. His very presence was a prayer, a silent testament to enduring faith, a poignant contrast to the growing emptiness around him. And then there was young Elena. She was perhaps 17, though the shadows in her eyes made her seem far older. Her spirit, I observed with a heavy heart, had been hollowed out by a family tragedy that had ripped through her life a few years prior, the sudden brutal death of her younger brother in an accident that, to her young mind, God had inexplicably allowed. She still attended Mass with her grandmother, a woman whose own faith was a quiet, unshakable force, but Elena's presence was a defiant one. She sat in the back pew, her arms often crossed, her jaw set, her gaze fixed not on the altar, but on some distant, invisible point beyond the stained glass windows, as if daring God to make himself known. Her anger was palpable, a raw, untamed thing that simmered beneath her quiet exterior. It manifested as cynicism, a bitter conviction that her prayers, once fervent, had fallen on deaf ears, unheard and unheeded. She saw no solace in faith, only a cruel indifference. I remember trying to speak with her after a particularly sparse Sunday service. "Elena," I'd begun gently, "I know things are hard, but sometimes—" She'd cut me off, her voice low, laced with a pain that felt too deep for one so young. "Hard, Father? Hard is watching your mother crumble. Hard is knowing you begged God, begged him, for just one thing, one mercy, and he just didn't care." Her eyes, usually veiled, flashed with a startling intensity. "My brother was a good boy. He had his whole life, and God let him go. So don't talk to me about prayer, Father. It's a foolish waste of time. A story for old people who have nothing left to lose." Her words, sharp and direct, pierced me. I saw in her the face of a generation that felt abandoned, a soul grappling with the age-old question of suffering and divine intervention and finding only silence. Her cynicism was a mirror reflecting the broader despair that threatened to engulf St. Jude's. If God didn't listen to a desperate girl's prayer for her brother, how could we expect him to listen to ours about a mere pile of bricks and mortar, no matter how sacred? How could I preach hope when the very foundation of her faith, and in many ways ours, had been so violently shaken? The weight of it all pressed down on me. I saw Mr. Rossi's steadfast hope, a flickering candle in the gathering gloom, and Elena's raw, wounded disbelief, a cold wind threatening to extinguish it. I felt the slow, agonizing decay of our parish, not just in the peeling paint or the dwindling collections, but in the spirits of the people I was called to shepherd. My own prayers, I confess, often felt thin, like smoke dispersing too quickly in the vastness of the heavens. I found myself searching desperately for a sign, any sign, that God had not in fact forgotten this small, struggling corner of his kingdom. The chill of the diocesan letters, the creak of empty pews, the despondent sighs of my oldest parishioners, all spoke of an ending, and in my heart, I knew that if nothing changed, if no divine hand intervened, St. Jude's, and perhaps the faith of many who clung to it, would soon be no more. This was the precipice we stood upon, the silent, aching void that preceded the thunder of a miracle, the chill of the diocesan letters, the creak of empty pews, the despondent sighs of my oldest parishioners, all spoke of an ending, and in my heart, I knew that if nothing changed, if no divine hand intervened, St. Jude's, and perhaps the faith of many who clung to it, would soon be no more. This was the precipice we stood upon, the silent, aching void that preceded the thunder of a miracle. We were, in every sense of the word, awaiting our last rites. The air in the rectory that Tuesday morning felt impossibly heavy, thick with the unsaid, laden with the weight of generations. It was a day etched into my memory, not for any dramatic flourish, but for its quiet, devastating finality. The sky outside was a bruised purple gray, spitting a persistent cold drizzle that mirrored the ache in my soul. Auxiliary Bishop Thompson's black sedan, a sleek anachronistic presence on our cobblestone street, pulled up precisely at 10 o'clock. Its tires crunched on the damp gravel of our small parking lot, a sound that, to my ears, resonated like the turning of a key in a lock, sealing our fate. Bishop Thompson was a man of precise movements and thoughtful silences. His voice, usually a resonant baritone, was softer than usual as he greeted me in the rectory parlor, a room I rarely used, now dusted for this solemn occasion. He accepted the weak tea I offered, his fingers briefly warming around the cup before setting it down, untouched. His gaze, often sharp and discerning, was tempered by a profound sadness, a pastoral concern that transcended administrative duty. He didn't prevaricate, not really. He began with acknowledgments of our parish's long history, its faithful community, the tireless efforts of its priests, words that, while kind, felt like eulogies. "Father Michael," he began, his eyes meeting mine with a directness that offered no comfort, only truth. "The numbers, as you know, have been declining for years. The upkeep of St. Jude's, a beautiful but aging structure, has become an insurmountable burden." He paused, taking a slow, deliberate breath. "The diocese has explored every possible avenue, every grant, every appeal. But we've reached a point of no return." The phrase hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach, a familiar sensation I'd been living with for months, but now amplified to an unbearable intensity. My throat felt constricted, my tongue a dry, useless thing. I knew what was coming, but hearing it articulated, hearing it with such stark, bureaucratic clarity, was like a physical blow. "The decision has been made," he continued, his voice barely a whisper, "to deconsecrate St. Jude's. The building will be sold. You have 30 days, Father, to prepare the parish for its closure. 30 days. A month. It wasn't an ending. It was an execution. 30 days to dismantle over a century of faith, to pack away memories, to tell people their spiritual home, the very ground where generations had knelt, laughed, cried, and found solace, was no longer sacred. The bishop spoke of practicalities, relocation assistance for parishioners, the preservation of historical artifacts, the proper decommissioning of the altar. But all I heard was the ticking clock, the relentless march towards an emptiness I couldn't yet fathom. I nodded, unable to speak, my eyes fixed on a dust mote dancing in a shaft of weak sunlight filtering through the window. It felt like watching a tiny, insignificant life going about its business, while my entire world crumbled. When Bishop Thompson finally rose to leave, his handshake was firm, a gesture of shared sorrow rather than official duty. "I truly am sorry, Father," he said, and I believed him. But sorrow, no matter how genuine, could not reverse the decree. The news once spoken seemed to travel not by word of mouth, but by the very air, permeating the ancient stones of St. Jude's. I remember the announcement at the evening mass that same day. The small congregation, already diminished, sat quietly, their faces etched with the weariness of a long, uphill battle. I stood at the pulpit, the familiar warmth of the wood beneath my hands offering little comfort. My voice, usually clear and steady, trembled as I delivered the impossible truth. "My dear brothers and sisters," I began, my gaze sweeping over their beloved faces, each wrinkle, each furrow, a testament to lives lived in faith. "It is with a heavy heart, indeed the heaviest of hearts, that I must inform you of a decision made by the diocese." The words seemed to catch in my throat, each one a stone I had to push past. "St. Jude's, our St. Jude's, will be deconsecrated." A collective gasp, soft yet potent, rippled through the pews. It was followed by a silence so profound it seemed to absorb all sound, even the distant city hum. Then a quiet weeping began, like a gentle rain starting after a long drought, individual drops becoming a steady patter. I saw Mrs. Rodriguez, her rosary beads clutched tight in her trembling hand, bury her face in her husband's shoulder. Young Thomas, the altar server, stared blankly, his innocent eyes wide with confusion. And in the front pew, Mr. Rossi, our sacristan, his shoulders, usually so ramrod straight with pride, slumped forward as if the weight of the entire church had suddenly descended upon him. His grizzled head, which had borne witness to 1,000 masses, bowed low, and I saw the glint of tears on his weathered cheeks. The announcement did indeed fall like a shroud over the parish. The church, once a beacon of light, now felt like a mausoleum. In the days that followed, the conversations were hushed, filled with lament. People spoke of their baptisms here, their weddings, the funerals of loved ones, the countless prayers offered within these very walls. It was more than just a building. It was the repository of their spiritual lives, the bedrock of their community. To lose it felt like losing a part of themselves, a severing of roots that ran deep into the sacred ground. But amidst the despair, a spark ignited, fueled by the unwavering, almost defiant faith of Mr. Rossi. I found him in the sacristy the morning after the announcement, polishing the chalice with an intensity that belied his age, his frail frame radiating a surprising resolve. He looked up, his eyes, though red-rimmed, burning with an internal fire. "Father Michael," he declared, his voice raspy but firm, "we cannot let this happen. St. Jude's is more than just bricks and mortar. It's where God lives for us. We must fight." "Mr. Rossi," I said gently, my own weariness heavy in my tone. The bishop was clear. "There are no more options." He shook his head, a stubborn set to his jaw. "Man's options, perhaps. But God's? We haven't exhausted those. We will pray. We will plead. To the Blessed Mother. She always intercedes." He gestured towards the large, centuries-old wooden statue of the Virgin Mary, a venerable relic of our parish, which stood on a ceremonial platform near the main altar. Her serene, painted face, though chipped in places, seemed to watch over us with an eternal, compassionate gaze. "A novena, Father. 9 days of prayer, fervent and true, to Our Lady, undoer of knots. We will ask her to untie this impossible tangle." A novena. In that moment of utter hopelessness, his proposal felt like a desperate, almost futile gesture, a last breath before drowning. Yet his faith, so raw and unshakable, was infectious, even to my own flagging spirit. It was a lifeline, however thin. How could I, their priest, deny them this final act of devotion? "Yes, Mr. Rossi," I said, a faint hope stirring within me. "A novena. We will pray." The news of the novena spread, sparking a flicker of desperate hope among some, and a fresh wave of cynicism in others. Among the latter was Elena. I found her after the noon mass, sitting alone in a back pew, her arms crossed, her expression a familiar mask of defiance and pain. She had heard about the novena, of course. Everything traveled fast in our small, embattled community. "A novena?" she scoffed, her voice sharp, cutting through the quiet reverence of the empty church. "To the Blessed Mother? What for, Father? To save a building? Do you honestly think she cares about a pile of bricks and mortar when she couldn't even save my brother?" Her words hit me with the force of a physical blow, not just for their bitterness, but for the raw, unhealed wound they exposed. Elena, barely 20 years old, had lost her younger brother Daniel in a sudden, tragic accident 2 years prior. He had been her closest companion, her confidant, and his death had shattered her world, leaving her angry, cynical, and utterly convinced that her prayers were falling on deaf ears. She had begged, pleaded, promised anything to God for his life, and in her mind, he had simply turned away. I sat beside her, the cold pew offering no warmth. "Elena," I began gently, choosing my words with care, "God's ways are not always ours. We don't always understand his plan, or why some prayers seem to go unanswered. But faith is about trusting even when we don't understand." She laughed, a short, humorless sound. "Trust? I trusted. I knelt until my knees ached. I prayed until my voice was hoarse. I promised him everything if he would just let Daniel live. And what did I get? Silence, Father. Just silence. So tell me," she challenged, her eyes, usually so bright, now dull with a profound weariness, "if God didn't listen when I begged him to save my brother, he's not going to listen to you now about a pile of bricks and mortar." Her words hung in the air, echoing the very doubts that sometimes gnawed at my own soul. How do you answer such pain? How do you preach hope to a heart so profoundly wounded by what it perceived as divine abandonment? I felt the weight of it all, the collective burden of my parishioners' despair, the administrative decree, and now, Elena's bitter, undeniable truth. My own prayers, I confess, often felt thin, like smoke dispersing too quickly in the vastness of the heavens. I found myself searching desperately for a sign, any sign that God had not, in fact, forgotten this small, struggling corner of his kingdom. I tried to explain the enduring power of faith, the community aspect of prayer, the mystery of suffering, but her gaze remained fixed, unyielding. She saw only the unfairness, the cold, hard facts of a world that had taken too much. I could see the battle raging within her, the faint memory of a childhood faith wrestling with the crushing reality of loss. She was caught, as was our entire parish, between Mr. Rossi's desperate hope and her own bitter resignation. And I, their priest, felt caught in the middle, trying to pastor a community on the brink, my own heart heavy with the fear that perhaps, this time, even God's grace might be out of reach. As the days dwindled, the novena commenced. Each evening a handful of the faithful gathered, their voices, though few, rising in earnest supplication. The air, usually so still and somber, vibrated with a fragile hope, a collective plea born of desperation. We lit candles, their flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the worn faces of our parishioners, reflecting the faint light they clung to in the encroaching darkness. I stood at the altar, my voice leading the prayers, my heart a complex tangle of hope and fear. Was this truly our last stand? Was this final fervent appeal to the Blessed Mother truly our only chance? The silence that followed each petition was deafening, pregnant with unspoken questions, with the fervent, desperate longing for a God who would, just this once, break through the veil of silence and show his face. We were down to our last hope, our final collective whisper in the face of an encroaching, irreversible end. The faint light of the altar candles, which had so recently illuminated the raw edges of our desperation, still clung to the cool stone of St. Jude's that Tuesday evening. It was the 9th and final night of our novena to the Blessed Mother, a last fervent offering of prayers that had begun with a flicker of hope and now ended in a palpable cloud of quiet despair. The auxiliary bishop's words, though gentle, had echoed through the hollow spaces of our hearts like a death knell. 30 days. 30 days until our spiritual home, our haven, our very identity, would be stripped away, deconsecrated, and rendered a silent, empty shell. I had tried in the preceding days to fill the silence with reassuring words, with theological treatises on God's mysterious ways, with reminders of his boundless love even in suffering. But my words felt thin, transparent against the thick, inarticulate grief that had settled over my small flock. Each morning I rose with a leaden spirit, praying for strength, for guidance, for something, to break the suffocating silence from above. Each evening, as the shadows lengthened and the hour of our novena approached, I felt the tightening knot of dread, knowing that with each Hail Mary, we were one step closer to the inevitable end. Mr. Rossi, bless his ancient heart, was a singular exception to this pall of resignation. His faith, forged in the crucible of a century of joys and sorrows, was not merely solid, it was elemental. He had organized this novena with the quiet, unyielding conviction of a man who knew the power of prayer because he had lived it. Every evening he would arrive early, his frail hands carefully arranging the votives, his gaze fixed on the statue of Our Lady as if in silent, intimate conversation. He moved with a reverence that bespoke a lifetime of service, his every gesture a prayer in itself. Yet even in him I detected a certain weariness, a subtle slump of shoulders that spoke not of doubt, but of a profound spiritual exhaustion in the face of such relentless adversity. And then there was Elena. She was present again tonight, though she kept to the very back pew, her arms crossed, her expression a careful mask of disdain. I knew her presence was less about faith and more about a morbid curiosity, perhaps even a desire to witness the final unraveling, to have her cynicism confirmed. She had scoffed when Mr. Rossi first proposed the novena, her young face hardening into lines that belonged on someone twice her age. "If God didn't listen when I begged him to save my brother," she'd told me, her voice sharp with ancient pain, "he's not going to listen to you now about a pile of bricks and mortar." Her words had pierced me, not just for their bitterness, but for the raw, unaddressed hurt beneath them. I had watched her since, her attendance sporadic, her eyes often scanning the vaulted ceiling as if daring God to prove her wrong. Tonight, however, her presence felt heavier, more pronounced, a stark counterpoint to the fragile hope that flickered in the hearts of others. On this 9th evening, the air was thick with unspoken grief. The final prayers of the novena were not whispered. They were murmured, heavy with a sense of finality. It wasn't the silence of peace, but the quiet of exhausted resignation. After the last Amen faded, I announced our intention to hold a procession, a final collective act of faith, a last walk through the familiar streets, carrying our most precious treasure, the centuries-old hand-carved wooden statue of the Virgin Mary, our parish's namesake and protector. The statue of Our Lady of Sorrows was not merely an artifact. She was a living presence within St. Jude's, carved from a single piece of dark, aged oak by an anonymous craftsman in a long-forgotten Bavarian village. She had made the perilous journey across the Atlantic with our parish founders in 1888. Her painted face, a study in serene grief, bore the faint cracks and chips of over a century of devotion. Her robes, once vibrant with blues and golds, were now muted, softened by time and the countless hands that had reached out to touch them. She stood about 4 feet tall, a substantial figure yet imbued with an ethereal grace. Her eyes, downcast yet strangely luminous, seemed to hold the accumulated sorrows and joys of generations. She had watched over so much. Baptisms where infants, squalling and vulnerable, were brought into the fold. First communions, their innocence luminous under her gaze. Weddings, where eager young couples exchanged vows of lifelong commitment, their hopes soaring towards a future she had already witnessed unfold countless times before. And funerals. So many funerals. The quiet, heartbreaking procession of coffins, the weeping relatives finding solace in her silent, enduring presence, her perpetual compassion. She was the anchor, the quiet witness to every cycle of life and death that had played out within these hallowed walls. To me, she was not just wood and paint. She was the embodiment of St. Jude's, her very essence intertwined with the soul of our parish. To lose her, or to see her placed in storage, would be like amputating a limb from the body of our community. Preparing for the procession was a sacred, almost mournful ritual. 4 stout older men, 2 of them Mr. Rossi and his lifelong friend, old Joseph, were tasked with carrying her. They carefully lifted the statue from its permanent niche near the altar, a collective sigh escaping the small gathering as she was gently placed upon a ceremonial gilded platform specially constructed for processions. The platform, itself an heirloom, was draped in a simple white linen cloth, embroidered with faint golden lilies. The men adjusted their grips, their faces etched with a mixture of reverence and the strain of the statue's considerable weight. As I took my place at the head of the procession, carrying the processional crucifix, I looked back at the small, somber flock that had gathered. Perhaps 30 souls, no more. They were the steadfast, the unwavering, their faces illuminated by the flickering candlelight they held in their hands. The flames danced, casting long, wavering shadows on the crumbling walls, making the very air seem to shiver with a fragile, almost desperate energy. This was not the joyous, triumphant procession of a feast day, filled with singing and laughter. No, this felt more like a funeral march, a solemn farewell to a beloved friend. The whispers that usually accompanied such events were absent, replaced by the soft shuffle of shoes on ancient stone, the occasional sniffle, and the hushed, almost internal murmur of prayers. Stepping out of the heavy oak doors of St. Jude's and into the twilight, the city's usual clamor seemed to recede, replaced by an unnatural quiet. The cool evening air brushed against my face, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and old leaves, mingling with the sweet, clean aroma of beeswax from our candles. The familiar streets of our forgotten corner of the city looked different tonight, transformed by the encroaching darkness and the wavering glow of our candles. Houses that usually seemed drab and unassuming now appeared to huddle together, their windows dark, as if witnessing our quiet sorrow. I led the way, my eyes fixed on the crucifix I carried, its silver gleam reflecting the candlelight. Behind me, the small stream of parishioners followed, their footsteps synchronized in a slow, deliberate rhythm. The statue of Our Lady, held aloft, seemed to float above the crowd, her serene face watching over us with that eternal, compassionate gaze. Her wooden robes, softened by the gloom, seemed to absorb the faint light, creating an almost ethereal glow around her. The air was thick with unspoken grief, a heavy blanket woven from decades of shared memories, of baptisms and burials, of first communions and final goodbyes, all tied to the fate of St. Jude's. My mind wandered, caught between the solemnity of the moment and a cascade of personal reflections. I thought of my own journey, the idealism of my early priesthood, the unwavering belief that God's plan was always clear, always triumphant. Now, standing here, leading my dwindling flock in what felt like a last, desperate act, that certainty felt distant, shrouded in the mists of doubt. Had I failed them? Had my prayers not been fervent enough? My faith not strong enough to stem the tide of decline? I preached of faith, of hope, of charity, yet in my heart, a thin, cold thread of fear wound itself around my conviction. I glanced back, catching sight of Mr. Rossi, his brow furrowed with effort, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. He moved with a strength that belied his advanced years, fueled, I knew, by an unshakable devotion. He had seen so much more than I had: wars, depressions, shifts in the very fabric of society. Yet his faith remained an unyielding column. Was it simply resilience, or was it something deeper? Something I was perhaps missing in my own moments of weariness. His presence was a quiet sermon in itself, a testament to the enduring human spirit clinging to the divine. Then my gaze fell upon Elena. She walked several paces behind the main group, a solitary figure, her candle held almost defiantly. Her face, usually so guarded, was now softened by the flickering light, revealing the faintest hint of the girl she once was, before tragedy had hardened her. Her lips were set in a thin line, her eyes darting from the statue to the faces of the older parishioners, as if searching for something, perhaps even longing for the peace she saw in their quiet determination. I knew the weight of her brother's death, the way it had fractured her world, making her question everything she had ever believed. To her, this procession must have seemed an exercise in futility, a desperate dance on the precipice of a confirmed void. Yet, she was here. Her cynicism, I suspected, was a shield, a protective shell around a deeply wounded heart that still, against all odds, yearned for an answer, for a sign that God had not truly abandoned her. We turned a corner and the imposing silhouette of St. Jude's loomed into view once more, its bell tower stark against the deepening twilight sky. The candles in our hands seemed to dim in comparison to the vastness of its stone facade. Yet their fragile light persisted, a defiant stand against the encroaching night. Every step felt laden with meaning. This was our final collective plea, a testament to a faith that was about to be extinguished, along with the lights of our beloved church. It was an act of surrender, yet also an act of profound assertion, an assertion that we still believed, even when belief felt like a heavy burden. The slow, measured pace of the procession was a deliberate act, a way of drawing out these final moments, of savoring the last vestiges of communal prayer in these familiar surroundings. Each street lamp we passed cast a brief, stark illumination on our faces, highlighting the lines of worry, the traces of tears, and the quiet dignity of enduring hope. We walked not with the expectation of a sudden, dramatic intervention, but with the quiet resolve of those who offer everything they have, simply because it is all they can do. It was a humble offering, a collective sigh of the soul, breathed into the indifferent vastness of the city night. My thoughts drifted to the countless generations who had walked these very streets, carrying this same statue, their prayers rising to the same God. Had they known such despair? Had they too felt the chill of abandonment? What distinguished their era from ours, their petitions from ours? Was our faith weaker, our devotion less pure, or was it simply the changing times, a world less inclined to listen for the whisper of the divine? I didn't have answers, only questions that tangled themselves into a knot in my heart. As we neared the church's main steps, the ground sloped gently upwards. The imposing facade of St. Jude's seemed to draw us in, not like a welcoming embrace, but like a grand, silent sentinel awaiting our return, a witness to our final act. The silence deepened further, broken only by the rhythmic scuff of shoes, the crackle of candle wax, and the quiet, almost inaudible rustle of the banners that flanked the statue. This was it, the culmination of 9 nights of prayer, of decades of devotion, of over a century of a parish's life. We were not merely walking home, we were walking towards an end. And in that poignant final journey, every soul present carried the heavy weight of what was about to be lost, and the fragile precious hope that perhaps, just perhaps, it was not yet too late. The air grew heavy with a stillness that seemed to press down on our small procession, a tangible weight compounded by the collective breath held in anticipation and dread. It was more than just the cold of the fading autumn evening. It was a chill that seeped into the very marrow of our bones, a premonition of finality. The rhythmic scuff of shoes on the damp pavement, the muted crackle of candle wax melting and dripping onto impatient fingers, the barely audible rustle of the worn fabric banners carried by acolytes. These small, intimate sounds had moments ago been the only anchors in a vast, silent sea of unspoken grief. They had marked our deliberate, somber pace, a heartbeat in the twilight. Now, even these familiar sounds seemed muted, swallowed by the ominous, looming silence of the church's approach, a silence so profound it felt as though the very air had ceased to move. We were not merely walking home to our sanctuary. We were walking towards an end, a culmination, perhaps even a final judgment for our dwindling parish. Each step was an echo of a century of faith, yet each felt heavier with the weight of our impending loss. In that poignant final journey, every soul present carried the heavy burden of what was about to be extinguished, and the exquisitely fragile, precious hope that perhaps, just perhaps, it was not yet too late for a miracle. My own heart, a wellspring of both pastoral duty and personal anguish, felt taut, stretched thin between the desperate pleas rising from my flock and the harsh reality of the diocesan decree. I tried to pray, but the words felt hollow, like dry leaves scattering in the wind, a fear creeping in that perhaps my own faith was as frail as the flickering candlelight. The main steps of St. Jude's rose before us, a flight of time-worn granite, each stone a testament to countless pilgrimages, smoothed to a subtle, dangerous sheen by generations of faithful ascent. They were broad and grand, designed for a more prosperous era, for a church teeming with worshippers, now seeming to mock our diminished numbers, our few scattered lights against the encroaching darkness. A shiver, not entirely from the cold, traced its way up my spine as I gazed at them. They felt ancient, sacred, but also forbiddingly cold, promising nothing but the cold, hard facts of our reality. At their base, the 4 men entrusted with our most precious treasure, the ancient hand-carved statue of the Blessed Mother, paused, gathering their strength for the final ascent. Their breath plumed in the crisp evening air, ghost-like exhalations of shared anxiety. Mr. Rossi, despite his advanced years and the visible tremble in his gnarled hands, was among them. His jaw was set with a fierce, almost defiant determination, a will that seemed to defy his frail frame. a flame in the encroaching darkness. I watched him, my heart aching with respect for his enduring, unwavering faith, even as I feared his heart might utterly break with the parish's final collapse. Mr. Rossi had been baptized in St. Jude's, had served as sacristan for over 50 years, had seen generations come and go. This church, this statue, was not just stone and wood to him. It was the very pulse of his existence. His eyes, though clouded with age, held a fierce, unwavering focus on the task ahead. The other three men, younger and ostensibly stronger, shared a similar grim solemnity etched upon their faces. Brother Thomas, a gentle giant of a man, stood opposite Mr. Rossi, his brow furrowed with concentration. Their shared burden, both physical and spiritual, seemed to weigh heavily on their shoulders. They exchanged quick, nervous glances, a silent acknowledgement of the precariousness of their task. The statue itself, nestled securely on its specially constructed wooden platform, seemed to possess a life of its own. She looked down upon us with that familiar, serene gaze, her painted eyes, though aged and faded, appearing to hold the wisdom of centuries, the quiet compassion of a mother who had witnessed countless human sorrows within these very walls. Her intricate robes, carved with meticulous detail, seemed to flow and ripple even when still, giving her a sense of imminent movement, a perpetual grace. She had been the silent witness to every baptism, every wedding, every funeral, every joy and every grief within these hallowed confines. She had been a constant presence, a steadfast anchor in the shifting tides of life, a quiet confidant to generations of the faithful. Now she was the very embodiment of our last desperate plea, a tangible physical manifestation of our dying hope. As the men adjusted their grip on the platform's worn wooden handles, a new nervous wave of anticipation rippled through the gathered faithful. A collective shiver seemed to pass through the crowd, a rustle of coats and a tightening of shawls. This was it, the ascent, the final placement of our Blessed Mother back in her sacred niche above the altar. After one last journey through the darkening streets she had watched over for so long, the air thickened with unspoken prayers, each soul offering up a silent petition, a final offering of hope. "Careful now, brothers," I murmured, my voice low, a prayer more than an instruction, barely audible above the whispers of the wind. My hands, clasped tightly before me, trembled slightly. I stood at the foot of the steps, a shepherd watching his flock embark on the final, most perilous leg of their journey, feeling acutely the burden of their hopes and my own helplessness. The flickering candlelight from 100 handheld tapers caught the anxious glint in eyes turned upwards, the subtle shift of weight as the crowd braced themselves, as if their collective will, their concentrated yearning, could somehow physically support the statue's arduous climb. With a deep, concerted breath, the four men began to ascend. The first step, then the second. The ancient wooden platform, built for this specific purpose generations ago, groaned faintly under the statue's considerable weight, a sound that seemed to reverberate in the unnatural hush that had fallen over the scene. It was a mournful sound, like the sigh of an old friend, heavy with the burden of its charge. Mr. Rossi, his brow deeply furrowed in concentration, took the lead on one side, his movements slow and agonizingly deliberate, each muscle in his arm straining visibly beneath his thin coat. His eyes, usually clouded with the milky haze of age, were now sharply focused, fixed on the statue's heavy base, ensuring every step was precise, every placement of his foot exact. His lips moved almost imperceptibly, a silent prayer, a litany of faith. The other men matched his rhythm, their heavy boots making soft rhythmic thuds on the cold, ancient stone, each thud a hammer blow against my heart, marking the passage of time and the approach of fate. The steps themselves were a silent, eloquent testament to time and countless pilgrimages. The very center of each riser was worn smooth, almost concave, by the tread of generations, by the fervent footsteps of ancestors coming to worship, to celebrate, to mourn. It was a beautiful, humbling testament to devotion, to the enduring power of faith. Yet now, under the immense burden of our most sacred image, under the dim, deceptive light of evening, that very smoothness became a treacherous, potential peril. My gaze, filled with a pastor's instinctive concern, swept anxiously over the ascent, noting the shadows that danced across the worn stone, making the exact contours of the steps elusive, playing tricks on the eye. A tight, cold knot of apprehension tightened in my stomach, a familiar clenching that often heralded ill tidings. I squeezed my eyes shut for a brief moment, offering a desperate, wordless prayer for strength, for guidance, for protection. As they reached the sixth step, a particularly wide, shallow riser, deceptively innocent in its worn grandeur, one of the younger men, Brother Thomas, who was positioned on the lower left side behind Mr. Rossi, faltered. Perhaps his view was momentarily obscured by the ornate, heavy drapery adorning the platform, a deep blue velvet embroidered with gold, catching the candlelight in a shimmering illusion. Or perhaps his footing simply found that treacherous, worn patch of stone at an awkward, unforgiving angle in the low, shifting light. Whatever the reason, his left foot, instead of landing firmly, seemed to skid, just a fraction of an inch, a barely perceptible slide on the polished granite. But it was enough. A collective gasp, sharp and sudden, tore through the silent throng. It was a sound born of instantaneous recognition, of shared gut-wrenching horror, like a single monstrous breath being drawn. My own heart leaped into my throat, a cold fist clenching instantly in my chest. A physical punch of dread. I saw it, the almost imperceptible wobble, a sickening tremor that ran through the entire structure, followed by a sudden violent lurch of the platform. It was as if the very ground itself had shifted beneath them, as if the ancient stones had suddenly lost their centuries-old footing. The statue of Our Lady, no longer held securely by its custom-fitted moorings, began to slide. It wasn't a gentle sway, a recoverable tremor. It was a sudden, sickening sideways motion, a betrayal of its stable perch, an unnatural slow-motion slide towards the precipice. Time, which had been trudging along with the slow, reverent pace of our procession, now stretched, distorted, into an agonizing eternity. In that horrifying, drawn-out moment, the entire world seemed to hold its breath. I felt the collective gasp of the crowd echo in my own lungs. The rising horror a palpable presence in the air. My eyes, refusing to blink, burned as I watched, transfixed, details flooding my vision with impossible clarity. The dust motes dancing in the candle glow, the frozen, terrified expressions on the faces of my parishioners, the slow, agonizing tilt of the revered image. I saw the men struggle. Brother Thomas, his face pale with alarm, stumbled backwards, his large frame momentarily off balance, his grip momentarily lost, a silent cry of despair twisting his features. Mr. Rossi, with a cry that was half gasp, half guttural prayer, a sound torn from the deepest recesses of his ancient soul, tried desperately to compensate, straining with a surge of strength that utterly defied his years, his muscles taut and quivering, his face a mask of desperate effort. But it was too late. The inexorable momentum was against them, a physical force that mocked their valiant struggle. The platform tilted precipitously, dramatically, groaning louder now, a sound of agony from the old wood, and the statue, our Blessed Mother, slipped irrevocably over the edge. Oh, the terror of that instant! I watched, powerless, frozen in place, my hands still clasped, my breath catching in my throat, as she tipped, slowly at first, with a dreadful, almost graceful hesitation, then gaining a horrifying, irreversible speed. Her serene face, which had gazed upon us with such calm detachment, with such eternal patience, now seemed to tilt towards the cold, unfeeling stone steps below, as if in silent resignation, as if she too understood the finality of the moment. The intricate folds of her carved wooden robes, meant to depict grace and fluid movement, now seemed to ripple, not with beauty, but with the violent, brutal physics of a falling object, a sacred form succumbing to earthly gravity. A cry, a single piercing lament, rose from the crowd, a collective sob that tore through the evening air, raw and primal, devoid of words, yet expressing the deepest anguish. Candles flickered wildly as hands instinctively flew to mouths, to faces, some reaching out as if to catch her, though she was utterly, tragically beyond their grasp. The world seemed to dissolve into a horrifying tableau. The falling statue, the scrambling, defeated men, and the frozen, despairing faces of my parishioners, illuminated by the frenetic dance of candlelight. My own mind, trained in theology and reason, steeped in the grand narratives of divine intervention, went utterly blank. All logical thought dissolved, replaced by a primal, desperate ache that resonated deep within my soul. "No!" I heard myself whisper, though the sound was swallowed by the sudden din of fear and gasps, lost in the communal wail. This wasn't just wood and paint, a mere object of devotion. This was the very heart of St. Jude's, our spiritual mother, our last fragile hope. To see her fall, to hear the inevitable sickening shattering of wood on cold, unforgiving stone, would be to witness the final, definitive destruction of our parish. Not just a building, but a community, a century of faith dashed to pieces. It would be the physical manifestation of our deconsecration, a violent, undeniable confirmation that our desperate prayers, the novena, my own fervent pleas, had indeed gone unheard. The weight of that thought was crushing, threatening to splinter my own faith along with the wooden statue. I saw Elena then, pushed forward by the surge of the horrified crowd, her face a mask of utter raw disbelief. The cynicism that had been her armor for so long. The hardened shell she had built around her grief seemed to melt away in that agonizing moment, leaving behind only the wide, vulnerable eyes of a child witnessing a profound injustice, a terrible violation. Her mouth was open, a perfect O of shock and unuttered anguish, but no sound emerged. She had scoffed at our novena, called it foolish, a waste of time. Yet in this moment, the impending destruction of what she considered an inanimate object seemed to crack open the deeper grief she carried, the pain of her own unheeded prayers for her brother, finally exposed and raw. My heart ached for her, for the painful reopening of old wounds this moment inflicted. The statue continued its terrifying plunge, gaining speed with each horrifying inch of its descent. I could almost hear the splintering wood, the crunch of painted plaster against the unforgiving granite steps, a sound that resonated in my mind before it could even happen. The sacred relic, imbued with generations of devotion, a tangible link to our spiritual ancestors, was plummeting towards its destruction, a symbol of our own falling fortunes. The flickering candlelight, which had illuminated our hopeful faces moments before, now cast long, dancing shadows, distorting the scene, making the fall seem even more terrifying, more absolute, a macabre performance staged by fate. It was a symbol, undeniably and brutally clear, of our own falling fortunes, of a faith that was about to be extinguished along with the lights of our beloved church. Down, down she went, a revered image, a beacon of hope for so many, rushing towards an end that would shatter not just wood, but the fragile, desperate hearts of us all, leaving behind only dust and the echo of unanswered prayers. The cold wind seemed to sigh, carrying with it the unspoken lament of a dying community. The cold wind seemed to sigh, carrying with it the unspoken lament of a dying community. And then, nothing. Not the crunch of splintering wood against unforgiving stone. Not the dull thud of a heavy object yielding to gravity's brutal law. Not the sharp collective intake of breath from a horrified crowd witnessing the final destruction of their last tangible hope. There was only the wind, which moments ago had felt like a harbinger of desolation, now holding its breath, hushed. The statue of Our Lady, our beloved ancient carving, did not crash. She simply ceased her descent. It was as if time itself had snagged on an invisible snag, a tear in the fabric of the temporal. One moment, she was plummeting, her serene face frozen in mid-fall, an eternal fraction of a second from catastrophe. The next, she hung there, motionless, perhaps a foot or so above the worn, chipped paving stones of the church steps. She wasn't leaning against anything, wasn't caught on a stray branch or a forgotten scaffold. She was simply there, suspended in the encroaching twilight, defying every principle of physics I had ever learned or instinctively understood. My mind, so accustomed to the logical progression of cause and effect, reeled, grasping for a framework, any framework, to contain what my eyes were undeniably witnessing. There was none, only impossibility, only grace. A hush fell, deeper and more profound than any silence I had ever known. It was not the absence of sound, but an active, consuming stillness that swallowed the distant city hum, the rustle of leaves, the frantic whispers of disbelief that had begun to rise. It was the silence of a world holding its breath, of hearts collectively ceasing their beat, listening to the unheard. Every soul gathered on those steps, from the oldest parishioner to the youngest, most cynical teenager, stood frozen, their gazes riveted on the impossible vision before them. Then, it began. Not with a burst, but a gentle emanation. From the very heart of the carved wood, a soft golden light began to bloom. It wasn't a harsh artificial glow, nor the stark brilliance of a spotlight. No, this light was warm, iridescent, as if captured starlight had decided to reside within the ancient grain of the timber. It pushed back the encroaching twilight not by force, but by invitation. The dimness around the statue did not flee, but rather dissolved, absorbed into this gentle radiance. It painted the rough edges of the carved drapery in hues I had never seen, lending a vibrant, living quality to the painted blue of her mantle, a subtle blush to her pale, patient face. Each dust mote dancing in the cooling air became a tiny, illuminated galaxy, swirling around her in a silent, cosmic dance. The air itself seemed to shimmer, imbued with an ethereal quality, no longer merely breathable space but a medium for this sacred illumination. And then, the scent. It arrived not gradually but as an overwhelming wave, a breathtaking immersion. It was the fragrance of roses, not just one rose, not a dozen, but the impossible, intoxicating perfume of countless blooming gardens, distilled into a single potent essence. It was sweet, profoundly sweet, yet clean, without cloying, filling the senses to the point of exquisite pain. It bypassed the intellect, bypassed the filters of skepticism, and went straight to the soul, an olfactory embrace that was both intensely physical and utterly spiritual. It was a scent that spoke of purity, of love, of the divine. It carried a warmth that belied the chill of the autumn evening, wrapping around us, penetrating every fiber of our being. The city's faint odors of exhaust fumes and damp earth were not just masked but obliterated, replaced by this heavenly aroma. It was so potent, so undeniable that it felt less like a smell and more like a presence, a comforting, loving hand placed gently upon our collective brow. The effect was immediate and absolute. The initial gasp, the murmurs of shock, the low cries of distress, all vanished. A profound, reverent silence descended upon the crowd. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, then with increasing momentum, knees began to buckle. Heads bowed. Not in defeat, but in absolute, humbled surrender. They fell not because they were pushed, but because the very ground beneath them seemed to recede, leaving only the imperative to kneel before the inexplicable, the sacred. I saw Mr. Rossi, whose frail hands had strained beneath the statue's weight, now on both knees, his face a roadmap of age and worry. But his expression was no longer one of despair. His eyes, though brimming with tears, shone with a light I hadn't seen since his wife passed, a light of pure, unadulterated awe. His lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear but instinctively knew were prayers of thanks, of wonder, of profound, unshakable faith. He wasn't just witnessing, he was being healed, renewed in the very fiber of his being. And Elena, ah, dear Elena, my heart had ached for her, for the anger and bitterness that had become her armor against a world she felt had betrayed her. She had stood apart, arms crossed defiantly, a silent sentinel of skepticism. But now, even her formidable defenses had crumbled. Her arms were no longer crossed. They hung loose at her sides as she too fell to her knees. Her posture was not graceful or practiced, but a sudden ungainly collapse, as if the very air had been knocked from her lungs. Her face, usually a mask of hardened indifference, was stripped bare. Her jaw hung slightly open, her eyes wide, staring at the suspended statue with an expression of utter disbelief that slowly began to morph into something else. It wasn't joy, not yet. It was primal awe, a shattering of her worldview so complete that it left her vulnerable, exposed, and utterly spellbound. A single tear, then another, traced paths through the dust on her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sorrow, but of release, of a dam breaking within her soul. The cynicism, the anger, the carefully constructed walls, all washed away by the scent of roses and the golden light. As for me, Father Michael, the priest charged with leading this flock, with understanding the mysteries of faith and guiding souls through doubt, I was as undone as any of them. My mind, usually a fortress of theological understanding and pastoral duty, dissolved. My carefully reasoned sermons, my long nights spent studying scripture and canon law, my attempts to find rational explanations for the world's pain, all of it seemed like straw against this wind of divine reality. I had taught about miracles, preached about them, exhorted my parishioners to believe in them, but to witness one, so direct, so undeniable, so utterly outside the bounds of any natural explanation, it was a humbling, terrifying, and ultimately glorious experience. My knees too found the cold stone. I knelt not out of conscious decision, but because my body, my very being, compelled me to. I looked at the statue, bathed in that impossible golden light, enveloped by the intoxicating fragrance, and felt a flood of emotion so potent it threatened to overwhelm me. There was fear, the kind of holy fear that acknowledges the vast, unknowable power of God. There was wonder, a childlike, unadulterated marvel at beauty and impossibility. And there was a profound, almost excruciating joy, a joy that welled up from the deepest part of my soul, confirming every inkling, every whisper of faith I had ever entertained. My hands, though calloused from years of ministry, felt suddenly clumsy, inadequate. I wanted to reach out, to touch the shimmering air, to confirm with my fingertips what my eyes and nose and soul already knew. But I dared not move. To disturb this sacred tableau felt like sacrilege. This was a moment of pure reception, of quiet absorption. We were not participants but humble witnesses, permitted a glimpse behind the veil, allowed to peek into the very heart of divine mercy. The statue hung there, a beacon in the rapidly deepening twilight, for what felt like an eternity. Minutes might have passed, or mere seconds. Time had lost all meaning. The golden light intensified, then softened, pulsing gently, as if the breath of God itself animated the ancient wood. The scent of roses seemed to deepen, saturating the very fibers of our clothing, clinging to our skin, marking us. It was a sensory miracle, a complete invasion of the natural world by the supernatural, leaving no room for doubt, no space for logical rebuttal. This was not a trick of the light, not mass hysteria, not a collective hallucination. The light was too steady, too warm, too real. The scent was too pervasive, too rich, too unmistakably specific. And the stillness of the statue, defying gravity, was too starkly, gloriously impossible. Every single person present, over 100 souls, had seen it, felt it, smelled it. Their unified reaction, the sudden profound silence, the collective drop to their knees, the tears streaming down hardened faces. It was the irrefutable evidence of a shared, undeniable encounter with the divine. My theology, which had once felt like a sturdy ship navigating the waters of faith, had just capsized. But instead of drowning, I found myself breathing in a new kind of air, an air infused with grace, floating in a sea of pure, unadulterated wonder. All my intellectual constructs, all my attempts to define and categorize God, had been swept away. In their place remained only the raw, majestic truth. God acts, God intervenes, God loves, and sometimes, just sometimes, He chooses to shatter the mundane with the miraculous, to speak not in parables or ancient texts, but in golden light and the intoxicating perfume of 1,000 roses, to catch us when we fall, and remind us that even the most lost of causes is never truly lost. I could only stare, my soul laid bare, utterly convinced that what I was witnessing was a direct, undeniable, and beautifully tender act of God. The silence that followed was unlike any I had ever known. It was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something so profound, so utterly other, that it swallowed all earthly noise. The golden luminescence that had cradled Our Lady pulsed once more, a gentle breath of light before slowly, majestically, receding back into the ancient wood. And then, as if moved by an unseen, tender hand, the statue began to right herself. There was no jarring motion, no sudden shift, but a slow, graceful pivot, a delicate ballet performed in defiance of gravity. Her painted gaze, serene and unchanging, seemed to sweep across us all, pausing for a lingering moment on Elena, before she settled back onto the platform with the softest sigh of wood against wood. We remained on our knees, suspended in a moment out of time. The air still thrummed with the scent of roses, now perhaps a little softer, but no less potent, a sweet, cloying perfume that clung to our clothes and filled our very lungs with its impossible beauty. My heart, which moments before had been a frantic drumbeat against my ribs, was now still, filled with a quiet reverence so deep it ached. My eyes, still blurry with unshed tears, scanned the faces around me. Mr. Rossi, usually so stoic, openly wept, his wrinkled hands clasped tight, his lips moving in silent prayer. Others sobbed or simply stared, their expressions a mixture of fear and ecstatic joy. Then, a small sound, almost lost in the lingering hush, a soft, metallic clink against the worn stone of the top step. It was a humble sound, yet in that supernaturally charged quiet, it resonated with an unexpected clarity. Our eyes, as one, were drawn to it. There, nestled against the moss-kissed stone where the statue had rested, lay a small, tarnished silver locket. It was plain, unassuming, perhaps an inch long, with faint, forgotten filigree etched into its surface, now obscured by generations of grime. It seemed impossible that it had been there all along, hidden within the folds of Mary's carved robes, shaken free only by the very act of its miraculous suspension. Elena, who had been kneeling closest to the steps, her head bowed low, slowly lifted her gaze. Her face was streaked with tears, her eyes wide, still reflecting the awe of the preceding moments. She looked at the locket, then at me, then back at the locket, as if seeking permission. There was an almost magnetic pull emanating from the small silver object. She hesitated for a long moment. Then, as if in a trance, she began to move. Her movements were slow, deliberate, each rising from her knees and creeping forward, a testament to a spirit grappling with something far beyond its understanding. She reached the locket, her hand trembling as she gently, almost reverently, picked it up. The weight of it in her palm seemed to ground her, though her expression remained one of profound bewilderment. She turned it over, her thumb tracing the tarnished surface. It wasn't secured by a clasp, but designed to open with a gentle pressure. With a soft click, it sprang open. We all leaned forward, straining to see. Usually one might expect a miniature portrait, a lock of hair, a memento of a loved one. But what lay within was something entirely different. Nestled within the shallow cavity, perfectly preserved against the passage of time, was a tiny, tightly rolled parchment. It was no larger than Elena's little finger, its edges slightly yellowed, but otherwise intact. The intricate script, though faint, was still legible. Elena's breath hitched. She looked at me again, her eyes asking a question I couldn't articulate. "What is it, child?" Mr. Rossi whispered, his voice hoarse, finally finding utterance. Carefully, with a delicate touch I would not have believed possible from the once cynical girl, Elena unrolled the miniature scroll. Her brow furrowed as she scanned the elegant handwriting. A gasp escaped her lips, a tiny sound filled with a dawning realization. It's a charter, she breathed, her voice barely audible. The original parish charter. From 1888. A ripple went through the small crowd. The original charter. Such documents were usually locked away in diocesan archives, or perhaps framed in a dusty sacristy. Why would it be hidden within the statue of Our Lady? A chill, not of cold but of holy revelation, ran down my spine. The pieces of this bewildering puzzle began to click into place, not intellectually but with the searing clarity of divine truth. Elena continued to read, her voice growing stronger, imbued with a newfound authority. It speaks of the founding family, the O'Malleys, and it says, in perpetual gratitude for the safe passage of their loved ones to the new world, and under the blessed intercession of the Virgin Mary, a perpetual endowment shall be established for the upkeep and spiritual flourishing of St. Jude's Parish, to be drawn from the family trust held by the diocesan bank, the funds to be renewed annually, in perpetuity. My breath caught in my throat. A perpetual endowment. For over a century, St. Jude's had struggled, declined, faced imminent closure, all while a provision, a generous, continuous stream of funding, lay dormant, forgotten, within the diocesan ledger. The O'Malley family had emigrated, their descendants perhaps unaware. The original agreement buried under layers of bureaucracy and the passage of time. It details an account number, Elena said, her voice shaking now, and contact names at the bank, all from the time. It says, the original fund, untouched, is meant to grow with interest. She looked up, her eyes meeting mine, brimming with an emotion that was no longer anger or bitterness, but pure, unadulterated wonder. Father Michael, it says the funds are more than enough to save St. Jude's, to rebuild, to ensure its future for generations. The air that had been so thick with the scent of roses now felt charged with an even deeper meaning. The statue hadn't merely been saved from destruction. It had been the instrument of our salvation. The slip hadn't been an accident, a random fumble by a tired man. It was a divine nudge, a necessary disruption orchestrated by a loving God to reveal the provision that had been there all along, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment, the right catalyst, to be uncovered. A collective gasp, then a wave of understanding, swept through the congregation. The elderly women, their faces etched with decades of worry, now shone with pure, unbridled joy. Mr. Rossi collapsed onto the steps, not in grief but in overwhelming relief and thanksgiving. His prayer answered in a way no one could have imagined. I looked at Elena, the girl who had scoffed at novenas, who had declared God deaf to her pleas, and saw in her eyes a flicker of profound faith, newly kindled, burning bright. The miracle wasn't just in the statue defying gravity. It was in the intricate tapestry of divine providence. God hadn't created something new out of nothing. He had revealed something old, something forgotten, something that had been waiting patiently for its time. He had used a moment of crisis, a collective act of desperate faith, and a small tarnished locket to show us that His love is not just spectacular but also meticulous, tending to every detail, even those buried for over a century. The tears that now streamed down my face were not of fear or despair, but of a boundless gratitude. A humbling realization of the boundless, compassionate wisdom of our God. We were not merely saved, we were chosen and loved in a way that defied all reason and understanding. The tears that streamed down my face were not of fear or despair, but of a boundless gratitude, a humbling realization of the boundless, compassionate wisdom of our God. We were not merely saved, we were chosen and loved in a way that defied all reason and understanding. That night, as the final echo of the miracle faded, leaving behind only the lingering, impossible sweetness of roses, I understood that the miracle of the roses had saved far more than just our beloved church building. It had breathed new life into an entire community. In the weeks and months that followed, St. Jude's transformed. The old familiar silence gave way to the joyous clamor of life. People, drawn by the incredible story that had spread like wildfire through the city, began to seek out our forgotten corner. The pews, once half empty, now brimmed with souls, some curious, some skeptical, but many, many more seeking the palpable faith we had found that evening. Young families returned, their children's laughter echoing through the nave, a sound I had not heard in years. Our finances, bolstered by the rediscovered endowment and the generous contributions of a newly inspired congregation, were no longer a whispered worry, but a vibrant testament to divine provision. The old stone walls, once seemingly destined for demolition, now stood as a beacon of hope, a physical manifestation of renewed spiritual life. The diocesan investigation, as one might expect, was thorough and exhaustive. Teams of officials, engineers, and even a few theologians visited St. Jude's. They interviewed every eyewitness, scrutinized the structural integrity of the steps, and painstakingly reviewed the newly discovered charter. Their final report, A thick binder of observations and testimonies contained no definitive scientific explanation for the suspended statue, the golden light, or the pervasive scent of roses. It simply noted a series of inexplicable eyewitness accounts and quietly, respectfully acknowledged that some events transcend earthly accounting. For those of us who had witnessed it, no official pronouncement was needed. The miracle was etched not just in the Church's history, but in the very fiber of our beings. Perhaps the most profound transformation I witnessed was in young Elena. The miracle had shattered the fortress of cynicism she had built around her wounded heart. On that night, as she cradled her brother's locket, which we later learned contained a lock of his hair, not a miniature scroll, and looked at the resettled statue of Our Lady, her face was not just a mask of awe, but of utter, disbelieving vulnerability. Her tears then were for something lost, yes, but also for something found. A glimmer of hope, a whisper of a God who had not forgotten her, even when she had forgotten him. Her faith, once crushed, was restored with a fire I have rarely seen. She became a whirlwind of energy, her vibrant spirit now channeled into the service of Christ. Elena, the girl who had openly scoffed at prayer, now joyfully runs our thriving youth program. Her own story a powerful, living testament to the fact that God answers even the prayers we've stopped believing in, often in ways more surprising and beautiful than we could ever imagine. She speaks of her brother now with peace, knowing that God's love is boundless, encompassing both life and loss. Often, in the quiet evenings, I sit in my study, the faint scent of roses sometimes seeming to linger on the air, and reflect on it all. I realize that God does not work in grand, abstract gestures alone. He works most beautifully in the particular. He saw a small parish in its final hour, heard its desperate prayers, and answered not with a thunderclap or a blinding flash, but with a gentle slip, a soft, warm light, and the overwhelming, impossibly sweet fragrance of roses. It was a tender, intimate reminder that He is always with us, meticulously attentive to our needs, ready to reveal His provision, and ever so willing to catch us when we fall. And in that profoundly personal act, He reminded us all that true faith is not about understanding every mystery, but about trusting in the unfathomable, constant love of a God who holds us, quite literally, in the palm of His hand.